The winter of 1878 came down on Northwood Reach like a hammer. It was not the gentle, blanketed cold of stories told by grandmothers in warmer lands, a cold that invited cozy fires and mugs of spiced cider. This was a different beast entirely. It was an active, aggressive cold, a predator that hunted for the slightest crack in a chinking, the smallest gap beneath a door. It seeped through solid logs, flowed like water through glass panes, and settled deep in the bones of the people who had dared to build their lives in its path. The wind that carried it was not a whisper, but a scream, a constant, high-pitched scouring that stripped away warmth like a thief in the night. The cabins of Northwood Reach were built to a single, time-honored design. They were sturdy, honest structures of felled pine, chinked with mud and moss, with stone fireplaces that devoured cords of wood with a desperate, insatiable hunger. They were the product of generations of knowledge, passed down from father to son, a testament to the stubborn resilience of settlers. And they were all failing. Inside these cabins, life had shrunk to a small, embattled circle around the hearth. Frost painted feathery, beautiful, and terrifying patterns on the interior walls. A bucket of water left too far from the fire would be skimmed with ice by morning. The settlers burned wood constantly, a frantic, losing battle against an enemy that never tired. They followed the old wisdom. They built lofts into every cabin, high spaces under the pitched roofs where the children slept. Heat rises was the catechism of their survival, a truth as solid and unassailable as the granite bones of the mountains around them. The warmest place in any home was always the highest. So they sent their children up the ladders into the smoky, precious pocket of warmth that gathered near the ceiling, while the adults shivered on the ground floor below. It was the way things were done. It was the only way they knew. But that winter, the rising heat seemed to vanish into the shingles, stolen by the wind. The lofts were barely warmer than the floors, and the children coughed in the cold, thin air. Among the settlers lived a woman named Ilara. She was a widow, her husband taken by a logging accident 2 summers before, leaving her with 2 small children, Samuel and Lyra. She was quiet, keeping mostly to herself, a fact the community attributed to grief, but also to a certain strangeness. Her husband had been an engineer from the city, a man filled with ideas from books, and some of that oddness, they whispered, had rubbed off on her. She possessed a trunk of his books, filled with diagrams of bridges and gears and strange, blocky buildings that looked nothing like the familiar cabins of the Reach. She was seen as an object of pity, a woman facing the coming winter alone with 2 small mouths to feed. That autumn, as the other families were banking their cabins with earth and splitting the last of their wood, Ilara began to build. Her existing cabin, the one her husband had built in the traditional way, was as cold and drafty as any other. She had spent the previous winter fighting the same losing war. This year, she would not. She chose a spot on a slight rise, sheltered by a stand of old firs, and began to dig. This was the first sign of her foolishness, according to the men who stopped to watch. She wasn't just clearing rocks for foundation posts, she was excavating. She dug a rectangle into the earth, 4 feet deep, lining the walls of the pit with fieldstone she hauled herself on a crude stone boat. Silas, the settlement's most respected builder, a man whose hands had shaped nearly every home in the valley, finally came to her. He was not an unkind man, but he was a man who believed in the gravity of proven things. He stood at the edge of the pit she was digging, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his brow furrowed with a mixture of concern and irritation. "Woman," he said, his voice a low rumble, "winter is a month away. You're digging a grave, not a foundation. What is this foolishness?" Ilara looked up from her work, her face smudged with dirt, her hands raw. She did not stop her labor, merely paused it. "I am building a house that will hold the heat," she said simply, her voice clear and steady. Silas scoffed, a sound like stones grinding together. "We all build houses to hold the heat. And we do it on the ground, not in it. You'll have water in there by the first melt." She shook her head. "The ground is warmer than the air, Silas. The cold comes from the wind. I will build where the wind cannot go." He pointed a thick finger at her. "This is from those books of your husband's, isn't it? City nonsense. It has no place here. You need a good floor, a tight roof, and a loft for the children. Heat rises. It is a law of God." The other men who had gathered murmured their agreement. It was the fundamental principle of their world. To deny it was to deny the evidence of their own senses, the feeling of warmth on their faces as they stood near a fire. Ilara laid another stone into the wall of her foundation. "The heat will stay where I put it," she said, and this quiet, unshakable certainty was what truly angered them. It was not the defiance of a fool, but the calm of a believer. The men walked away, shaking their heads. The word spread through Northwood Reach. The widow had lost her senses. She was building a hole in the ground and intended to live in it. The laughter was not loud or cruel, not at first. It was the sad, knowing laughter of practical people watching a dreamer walk toward a cliff. They pitied her. They pitied her children even more. Ilara worked alone. The sun rose and set on the rhythm of her labor. The scrape of her shovel, the thud of stones being set, the rasp of her saw against wood. Her hands, once soft, became a cartographer's map of hardship, calloused and cracked. She ignored the whispers and the pitying glances. Her motivation was not in their approval, but in the memory of the previous winter, of Lyra's small body racked with a cough that echoed in the frigid air of their old cabin, of Samuel's pale face as he huddled under every blanket she owned, still shivering. That memory was a fire in her belly, a fuel that burned hotter than any oak log. While she dug and built with painstaking slowness, the rest of the community bustled with their own familiar preparations. Silas and his crew raised a new cabin for a newly arrived family in less than 3 weeks. It was a fine example of their craft, with tightly notched logs and a great stone hearth. They worked with the confidence of experience, their movements swift and sure. They would glance over at Ilara's strange pit, her slow, meticulous work on what looked like 2 walls instead of 1, and they would shake their heads. She was wasting precious time. The geese were already flying south, and the nights were growing a sharp, crystalline edge. The hammer of winter was poised to fall. Her design was a puzzle to them. After the stone foundation was complete, she laid a heavy timber floor over it, raised a foot off the earthen bottom of the pit. Then she began the walls. But she built 2 of them. An outer wall of thick, sturdy logs, notched and fitted as any cabin would be. But then, a foot inside that, she began to build another, inner wall of smaller, squared-off timbers. The gap between them seemed a terrible waste of space and wood. Silas, passing by one afternoon, could not contain his professional disdain. "You're building a box inside a box?" he called out. "What for? To give the mice a warm place to nest?" Ilara did not answer with words. She gestured to the great pile of dried moss, sawdust from the lumber mill, and bags of sheep's wool she had been collecting all summer. For weeks, as she built the walls higher, she packed the space between them with this mixture. She tamped it down, layer by layer, creating a dense, insulated core. The men saw it as more foolishness, an invitation to rot and insects. A wall should be solid log, a barrier of pure strength against the elements. Her wall was a strange, soft sandwich. The roof was another offense to their sensibilities. Instead of the steep pitch and high loft they all favored, hers was a low, gentle slope. It made the cabin look squat, half buried. There was no room for a loft, no high place for the precious heat to gather. "You've built a shed, not a home," one of the women told her, her voice laced with genuine concern. "Where will the children sleep? On the floor, in the coldest air?" Ilara simply smiled and continued her work, laying a thick ceiling of beams, followed by a layer of packed clay, and finally heavy sod cut from the meadow. It was a living roof, a blanket of earth. Her hearth was the final, baffling piece of her strange creation. She did not build a great, open fireplace that could take a 4-foot log. Instead, using the diagrams from her husband's book and clay from the creek bed, she constructed a massive, blocky stove of stone and brick in the very center of the single room. It was a formidable, hulking thing, with a small iron door for feeding it, and a winding, convoluted flue pipe that snaked through its masonry mass before exiting through the roof. It looked inefficient, too small to heat anything. It was designed to be fed with small billets of wood, not the hardy logs they were used to. It was, to them, the ultimate folly in a project defined by it. By the time the first snow fell, a light, scouting dust of white, her cabin was complete. It was an oddity on the landscape, hunkered down into the earth as if hiding from the sky. Its windows were small, its roof low and green with late-season grass. Its single door was thick, and just inside it, she had built a second, smaller door, creating a tiny, enclosed entryway. The community had stopped laughing. The season for laughter was over. Now there was only a grim certainty. The widow and her children would suffer for her pride and her foolishness. They would either freeze, or they would be forced to beg for shelter in the sensible, proper cabins of their neighbors. The great storm did not arrive with a warning. It simply appeared. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of slate, the air grew unnaturally still, and a profound silence fell over the valley. Then the wind began. It came from the north, a solid wall of moving air that hit the settlement like a physical blow. It carried with it a blinding, scouring snow, not flakes, but tiny, hard pellets of ice that stung any exposed skin. The temperature, which had been merely cold, plummeted into a realm of brutal, life-threatening extremity. This was not a storm, it was a siege. Within hours, every cabin in Northwood Reach was under assault. The wind, like a living thing, found every tiny flaw. It shrieked through the chinking, moaned in the chimneys, and slammed against the walls with the force of a battering ram. The fine, icy snow was driven through invisible cracks, forming pale, ghostly drifts on the floors inside. The fires, which had been the heart of every home, became ravenous beasts. The settlers fed them constantly, but the heat was ripped away as fast as it was generated. The wind acted like a giant bellows, sucking the warmth straight up the chimneys and into the howling dark. In Silas's home, the finest-built cabin in the settlement, the battle was being lost. His wife and children were huddled together, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air of their own living space. The walls groaned under the pressure of the wind. A fine powder of snow was dusting the floor near the door. Silas stood by the hearth, feeding log after log into the fire, his face grim. He could feel the cold radiating from the walls. He could feel the draft that snaked across the floor like a cold reptile. His woodpile, which he had thought would last until mid-January, was shrinking at a terrifying rate. He had built this house with his own hands, with all the skill and knowledge he possessed, and it was not enough. He thought of the others, the younger families with smaller woodpiles, the elders whose strength was failing. He knew what was happening in his house was happening in every house. They were all fighting the same fight, and they were all losing. The storm was not just a hardship, It was an existential threat. It was stripping away the illusion of their control, revealing their profound vulnerability. And in the midst of his growing fear, a strange thought intruded. The widow. He pictured her squat, half-buried cabin, with its tiny stove and its foolish, soft walls. A bitter pity filled him. Whatever suffering they were enduring, hers would be 100 times worse. Meanwhile, inside Ilara's cabin, there was silence. The storm was not a presence, but a rumor. The low, earth-banked walls and the heavy sod roof deadened the shriek of the wind to a distant, muffled hum. There was no rattling, no groaning, no sense of a structure under siege. The thick, insulated walls did not radiate cold. They were neutral to the touch, holding the interior temperature steady. The small, deep-set windows were clear of frost. A single, small fire of birch logs burned lazily inside the masonry stove. It had been burning like that for hours, needing only a small piece of wood every hour or so. The stove itself was the heart of the home. Its massive stone and brick body had absorbed the heat, and now it radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth into the room. It was not the scorching, localized heat of a fireplace, which left one's back to freeze while one's front roasted. It was an even, constant heat that filled the entire space. Samuel and Lyra were not huddled by the fire. They were playing on a rag rug in the middle of the floor, their cheeks rosy, their movements free and unencumbered by layers of blankets. Ilara sat in a chair, mending a pair of socks, the soft light of an oil lamp falling on her work. The air was warm, still, and safe. Her creation was being tested by the worst the winter could offer. It was not just holding, it was winning. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights. When it finally broke, an eerie, crystalline silence descended, and the world was a sculpture of white and blue. But the cold that followed was even more dangerous. It was a still, piercing cold that sank its teeth into everything. The temperature dropped to a level the settlers had never before experienced. It was a cold that cracked trees and froze the river solid to its bed. For the families in Northwood Reach, the end of the storm was not a reprieve, but the beginning of a new crisis. Their woodpiles were decimated. Their homes were iceboxes. Their spirit was cracking like the frost-covered trees. The stark contrast was absolute. In the traditional cabins, families burned their furniture to stay alive. They broke up crates, chairs, anything that would burn. The interior temperature hovered just above freezing. They rationed food because it was too cold to cook properly. Sickness began to spread, a deep, rattling cough that thrived in the frigid, damp air. Desperation was a palpable thing, a guest at every hearth. In Ilara's cabin, the temperature held steady at a comfortable 60 degrees. Her woodpile was barely diminished. She had burned less wood in 3 days of the worst storm in memory than her neighbors burned in a single, ordinary winter evening. Her children were healthy. Her home was an island of impossible warmth in a sea of deadly cold. The first visitor arrived out of desperation. It was Silas. His daughter, who lived on the other side of the settlement, had sent her boy to him. Her husband was ill, and their wood was gone. They were burning the cradle. Silas, his face a mask of pride and fear, had set out to check on them, but the cold was so severe it drove him back. He was on his way home when he passed Ilara's cabin. He saw a thin, lazy curl of smoke rising from her chimney. It was not the frantic, billowing smoke of a desperate fire, but the calm exhalation of a slow, efficient one. He did not know why he turned toward her door. Perhaps it was to offer a warning, or perhaps a primal, desperate curiosity he could not suppress. He knocked on the thick outer door. He heard a bar being lifted, and the door opened. Ilara stood there in the small enclosed entryway. She was not bundled in furs and blankets. She wore a simple wool dress. Silas was so stunned he could not speak. He stood in the Arctic air, his own breath freezing on his beard, and stared at her. "Silas," she said, her voice calm. "Come in. You look frozen." She stepped back and opened the inner door. The warmth that met him was not a blast of heat. It was a physical presence, a gentle, encompassing wave of comfort that seemed to soak directly into his frozen core. It was the kind of warmth he had not felt since October. He stumbled inside, his eyes wide, trying to comprehend what he was experiencing. He looked around the single, large room. He saw her children, playing quietly on the floor. He saw no frost on the walls. He saw the massive stove in the center of the room, radiating a silent, steady heat. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the interior wall. It was not cold. It was not even cool. It was just there, neutral, a barrier the cold could not cross. He looked at the small pile of wood next to the stove. It was a pitifully small amount, barely enough to last an hour in his own fireplace. He looked at the lazy, calm fire through the small iron door. He looked at the children, their faces healthy, their movements easy. He looked at Ilara, who was watching him with a quiet, knowing patience. All his certainty, all his lifelong knowledge, all his pride in his own craft, crumbled to dust in that moment. Everything he thought he knew about heat, about cold, about survival, was wrong. He was wrong. The foolish woman, the dreamer digging a hole in the ground, had been right. Ilara did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep, weary compassion. She understood the journey he had just taken in the space of a few seconds, the shattering of a world. She simply gestured to a wooden chair near the stove. "Sit, Silas," she said softly. "I will make you some tea." Her quiet triumph was in that simple, humble act of hospitality. It was more devastating to his pride than any boast could have been. He sank into the chair, the warmth seeping into him, and for the first time in 3 days, the frantic knot of fear in his chest began to loosen. It worked. Her impossible cabin actually worked. Silas did not stay long. He drank the hot tea, stammered a thank you, and left. He did not go home. He went straight to his daughter's cabin, his mind racing. He returned half an hour later, not alone. He brought his daughter and her 2 small children with him. He did not ask for permission. It was a silent, desperate plea. Ilara simply opened her door wider and let them in. The 2 families, the one warm and prepared, the other frozen and desperate, merged in the small, safe space. The children, who had been shivering and listless, slowly began to thaw, their eyes growing wide as they felt the pervasive, gentle warmth. Word spreads fast in a small community, but news born of desperation travels at the speed of light. Silas's action was a signal flare. If Silas, the master builder, the ultimate skeptic, had taken shelter with the widow, then the rumors must be true. Within hours, another family appeared at her door, their faces etched with cold and shame. Then another. Ilara took them all in. Her single room became a sanctuary, filled with the hushed, awe-struck whispers of her neighbors. They sat on her floor, on her benches, anywhere they could find space, soaking in the impossible warmth. They touched the walls. They stared at the strange, massive stove. They watched her feed it a single, small log and saw how the heat remained constant. The laughter was gone. The mockery was a distant, shameful memory. In its place was a profound, silent, and humbling respect. The next morning, after the worst of the deep cold had broken, Silas returned. He came alone this time. The other families had returned to their own homes to assess the damage and count their losses. He found Alara outside, calmly splitting small rounds of wood. He stood before her, his hat in his hands, a titan of a man made small by humility. He did not look at her face, but at the ground between them. For a long moment he said nothing. The only sound was the crisp air and the distant caw of a raven. "How?" he finally asked, his voice thick with emotion. It was a question that contained a dozen others. "How did you know? How did this work? How could I have been so blind?" Alara stopped her work and leaned the axe against the splitting block. She looked at him, her gaze direct but not judgmental. "My husband had books," she began, "from the old countries, places where the winters are long and the wood is scarce. They learned a long time ago that it's better to trap the heat you make than to make more heat." She led him back inside her cabin and she began to explain. She was no engineer, but she had read the books until she understood the principles. She spoke of thermal mass, showing him how the thick masonry of the stove stored heat like a stone in the sun, releasing it slowly for hours. She spoke of insulation, explaining how the packed moss and wool in the walls created a barrier of still air that the cold could not easily penetrate. "The cold doesn't come through the log," she said, tapping the inner wall. "It comes through the cracks, but mostly it's the wind that steals the heat. My outer wall breaks the wind. The air between the walls stays still, and still air is the best blanket there is." She pointed to the low ceiling. "Heat does rise, Silas. You were right about that. But if you give it nowhere to go, it has to stay. My roof is too heavy and too thick for the heat to escape. So it fills the room, from the ceiling all the way down to the floor." Silas listened, his face a study in concentration. He was a craftsman, a man who understood wood and stone and angles. He was translating her strange, book-learned words into the physical reality he knew. He saw the logic, the simple, profound elegance of it. It was a system, a complete thought, not just a pile of logs. He had spent his life building shells to fight the cold. She had built a vessel to hold the warmth. The difference was everything. He looked at the books she showed him, the diagrams of insulated walls and masonry heaters. He touched the pages, his calloused fingers tracing lines drawn by a man long dead in a land far away. He had built dozens of cabins. He had built a community, and he realized, with a deep and painful clarity, that he had been building them all wrong. "Teach me," he said. The two words were not a request. They were a surrender, a plea. The proudest man in Northwood Reach was asking a quiet widow to be his teacher. Alara nodded. She held nothing back. She saw no victory in his defeat, only an opportunity. An opportunity to keep the children of their community safe, to end the yearly war against the winter, to replace fear with security. She shared everything she knew, explaining the principles, demonstrating the techniques, answering every question he had with patience and clarity. That spring, a new sound echoed through Northwood Reach. It was the sound of digging. Silas, his authority now backed by newfound wisdom, led the charge. He did not patch the old cabins, he declared them obsolete. Family by family, they began to build anew. They dug deep foundations into the earth. They raised double walls, and the children spent weeks gathering moss and wool to pack between them. They built the low, heavy roofs and learned the intricate art of constructing the central masonry stoves. The landscape of the settlement began to change. The tall, proud, and inefficient cabins were slowly replaced by the squat, humble, and warm structures of Alara's design. The work was slower, more meticulous. There was no rushing. They measured carefully. They fitted the stones and timbers with a new sense of purpose. Silas was the most dedicated student of all. He worked side by side with Ilara, learning every detail, his former pride replaced by a craftsman's quiet focus on getting it right. The community, once fractured by skepticism and mockery, was now united in a common, hopeful effort. They worked together, sharing labor and resources, their shared memory of the great storm and the impossible warmth of the widow's cabin binding them together. A year later, a government surveyor passed through the region, mapping the territory. He arrived in Northwood Reach on a bitterly cold day in late autumn and asked for lodging. He was given a place in one of the new cabins. He spent the night in profound comfort, waking in a room that was evenly and effortlessly warm. He had traveled all over the Northern Territories, and he had never experienced anything like it. He asked Silas, who was now the settlement's official leader, about the unique design. Silas, without a moment's hesitation, gave all the credit to the woman who had taught him. He told the surveyor the whole story, of her quiet diligence, of their foolish mockery, and of the storm that had proven her right. The surveyor was a man of letters. He drew detailed sketches of the cabin's design and wrote down Ilara's principles of insulation and thermal mass. When he left Northwood Reach, he took the story and the plans with him. The tale of the widow's cabin, the Northwood Stove House, as he called it, was printed in journals and newspapers back east. The idea began to spread. In other fledgling settlements, on other unforgiving frontiers, settlers began to hear of a new way to build, a way to survive the winter not through brute force and endless fuel, but through quiet wisdom. The idea traveled, a quiet and powerful legacy spreading far beyond the small valley where it was born. The winter ceased to be an enemy in Northwood Reach. It was still cold, still harsh, but it was no longer a predator waiting at the door. It became just a season, a time for rest and reflection. The children no longer coughed in drafty lofts. The sound of the wind was just the sound of the wind, not a threat. The community thrived, secure in their warm, efficient homes. Ilara never sought credit or praise. She lived as she always had, quietly and simply. Her satisfaction was not in being proven right, but in the sight of healthy children playing in the snow, and the lazy, efficient curls of smoke rising from the chimneys of the safe, warm homes that now filled the valley. She had faced down the skepticism of her community and the fury of the natural world, armed not with strength, but with knowledge, patience, and a quiet, unshakable belief in a better way. The story of that winter became a lesson, passed down through generations. It was a reminder that the loudest voices are not always the wisest, and that true strength often lies not in clinging to tradition, but in the courage to question it. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from the quietest corners, born not of ambition, but of necessity. The greatest wisdom the people of Northwood Reach ever learned was not how to fight the cold, but how to understand it. A lesson taught to them not by a powerful man or a seasoned builder, but by a humble widow who listened to the lessons in a book and had the courage to build a house that held the warmth where it was needed most. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet wisdom, share it with someone who believes in challenging the way things have always been done. And follow for more inspirational stories of survival, ingenuity, and the quiet courage that changes the world.